everyone to the Gluten Intolerance Group's first virtual educational event of 2022, Celiac Disease and Non-Celiac Gluten Sensitivity Today and into the Future, with our esteemed guest, Dr. Stefano Guandolini. We're really happy and honored to have him with us. My name is Lola O'Rourke. I'm the education coordinator here at the Gluten Intolerance Group. I'm also a registered dietitian, and I will have the pleasure of having a conversation with Dr. Guandolini. Before I introduce him further, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Gluten Intolerance Group for those who aren't familiar. The Gluten Intolerance Group, or GIG as it is also sometimes known, has been in existence now for 48 years. Our mission is to make life easier for everyone living gluten-free. And we do this in many different ways, but there really are sort of three main basic approaches to how we do this. The first is through food safety programs, the second is through support programs, and the third is through education. So back to food safety, we have a food certification program, which probably many of you are familiar with, our gluten-free certification organization, or GFCO. We certify tens of thousands of products in countries around the world as gluten-free. Products go through a very rigorous, in-depth, and ongoing process so that consumers can have a high level of confidence in their gluten-free status. We also have a gluten-free food service validation program, or GFFS. We do somewhat similar work with gluten-free food services. So this includes not only restaurants, but also university dining halls, hospitals, food trucks, meal delivery services, all sorts of food service establishments. We work with them to look at their ingredients, look at their processes in the kitchen, everything that might impact their ability to serve safe gluten-free food so that they can do that for their customers and patients. The second area is our support groups. We have a network of about 80 support groups all across the country and a couple international as well. Approximately 20 are geared towards kids and young adults. And these are places where people can connect locally with other people who are living gluten-free. Sharing information, resources, recipes, simply sharing support, whatever it may be. These are just great places for people to connect. And I will add that you can find a listing of all of our support groups on our website at gluten.org. And if anyone is interested in starting a support group, we're always happy to work with people on that as well. And just backtracking for a moment, also on our website, you can find a directory of the certified gluten-free products, as well as of the validated safe spots. The last arm of what we do is really education, which permeates so much of what we do. We provide education on all aspects of the gluten-free diet and of living gluten-free, from really the nuts and bolts of what constitutes a gluten-free diet, the details of how to read labels, how to have a healthful gluten-free diet, special issues relevant to kids, to pregnant women, really all aspects for all different age groups. And we provide this information on our website in the form of articles. We're constantly providing fresh content, usually a couple of times a week. We have a blog. We have a variety of educational bulletins. Our social media networks are very active, and we disseminate a lot of information there. We print a magazine for kids called the Generation GF magazine. And then we do various other things. And this event is one good example of our educational activities. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Guandolini. Welcome, Dr. Guandolini, and thank you so much for being with us from Chicago.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so Dr. Guandolini is the founder and director emeritus of the University of Chicago Celiac Disease Center and former chief of the section of pediatric gastroenterology of the University of Chicago. He has authored over 200 publications in peer-reviewed journals. He has contributed more than 30 chapters to gastroenterology books and published 5 books as editor. He has presented over 400 invited speeches nationally and internationally. And he's been recognized as one of the top 5% of doctors in the US continuously from 2008 through 2021. And he has received numerous awards nationally and internationally for contributions in the field of pediatric gastroenterology. We're really honored to have you with us. Thank you. So
Thank
before
you
we
very
get,
much, Roland.
yeah,
I must say, after such a resounding introduction, I can only disappoint everyone from now on. So
I don't think so.
I'll try my best not to.
So just a couple of housekeeping details. Please keep your microphones and video cameras off during the session. If you have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat. The questions will be monitored by my colleagues, Allison Myers, who handles all of our social media, and Eliza Sherman, our communications specialist. They will be answering some questions as possible as we're going along, and they will be compiling questions so that we can answer as many as possible towards the end of the session as well. And Jeannie Reed, our marketing manager, will be handling technical issues behind the scenes. All right, let's get started. Dr. Guandolini, I thought it would be interesting for you to provide a sort of framework before we get into, what people can be doing now and should be aware of now to really optimize their health and well-being, to look at what you've seen over the last 25 years that you have been involved in the field of celiac disease and gluten-related disorders in this country. I know you were involved even before then in Italy. But what have been some of the advancements and things that you've seen?
Well, things have evolved enormously in the last 25 years, Lola, for sure. When I arrived in this country, the idea, for instance, was that celiac disease was a rare condition in this country. It was just an European affair. And most physicians would just not think necessary to be knowledgeable about this condition or to look for it. In fact, the common idea was that the prevalence was about 1 in 10,000, which we know now not being the case anymore, of course. Yeah. The availability of gluten-free foods was extremely scarce. But more importantly, we had at that time only obsolete serological testing for celiac disease. In other words, the diagnosis had to rest on the physician's ability of suspecting this condition and just a couple of blood tests which were not specific for celiac disease. For instance, the anti-gliadin antibodies, the old anti-gliadin antibodies, which now are completely obsolete because of their low specificity and sensitivity, but that's all we had basically. The anti-endomysium antibodies, which were a step forward, appeared in Europe toward the late 80s, but it took a long time for this country to actually begin using them. And then the more sensitive tissue transglutaminase antibodies, of course, only followed the discovery of TTG as the autoantigen of celiac disease, which occurred basically in '96. So we are talking about a revolution in the last 25 years.
So much better ability to diagnose people, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What about advancements in terms of the ability for people who are diagnosed, to remain healthy? And I know it's interesting to look at just the research and what has happened, and we'll circle back around, I think, at the end of our conversation to hear a little bit from you about future research that may enhance things even further. But do you think that people who specifically with celiac disease are better able to remain gluten-free, maintain optimal health now?
So yes and no. The reason I say yes is because, of course, the awareness about celiac disease has grown exponentially in the last 25 years, especially in the last 10, I want to say. And with increased awareness, it comes a better realization of what must be done to remain healthy once you have been diagnosed. The gluten-free diet, celiac disease is unique. It's the only autoimmune condition in which we know what is the trigger, we know what is the autoantigen. We don't know any of that for all of the other autoimmune conditions. So people with celiac disease in this regard are lucky. Eliminating completely gluten is, of course, the best and the only so far way of ensuring health. So the increased awareness has been very useful. What has not been very useful, and that's why I said initially yes and no, is the fact that people, the awareness of the importance of gluten-free basically went on to involve other conditions which actually are not benefiting from gluten-free diet, to the point that, as you certainly know, there are currently almost 3 million people in the United States that follow a gluten-free diet without having a diagnosis of celiac disease.
Yeah.
And I was just reading today a forecast in terms of the market for gluten-free foods. It is estimated that by 2026, there will be more than $11 billion worth of profits, basically annually, for gluten-free products. So why am I saying that this may not be advantageous for people with celiac disease? The reason I'm saying this is that I hear this all the time, is that sometimes people at large, are not really keen to understand and appreciate the absolute need to be zero tolerant for celiac people. They think it's a fad. Yeah. They think, yeah, right, if there is some cramps, what's the big deal? So the attention to this condition that really needs to be completely
right. So it's sort of a double-edged sword sort of situation.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I think this will lead us into the next point that I wanted to address, which really is talking a little bit more about people who have been diagnosed with celiac disease on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who have had celiac disease ruled out or are self-diagnosed as having non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Because when you go on to talk about some of the things that are top of mind for maintaining health and wellness, it's going to be different for those two groups of people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, if we open the Pandora vase of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, we could fill easily the whole hour and beyond, of course. As you know, there are entire meetings dedicated to this entity. And the reason it is so vast is because we know basically nothing about it. We don't even know if the diet has to be restricted to to wheat elimination, or has to involve rye and barley, for instance. And the reason is that only a minority of people that have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which I think I've been on a mission in the last years to try and convince all of my colleagues. I've convinced many, I must say, that the name is a misnomer. It should be called non-celiac wheat sensitivity. And in fact, this is becoming more and more the term preferred by the scientific community. This may seem just semantic, but it's not. The problem is that the studies documenting beyond any doubt that this entity is due to gluten per se are just a handful and highly criticizable as well. I remember, if I can just, a recent meta-analysis that was done on all the published papers that had employed the placebo-controlled, double-blind, crossover trial with gluten. They concluded that in more than 80% of cases, the patients were not able to distinguish when they were exposed to gluten compared to when they were exposed to placebo. So in some instances, it may be a placebo-nocebo effect. But in many cases, I'm not saying that this entity don't get me wrong. I truly believe that non-celiac wheat sensitivity is a real entity. And that people benefit from eliminating wheat from their diet. The problem is we have no markers. Unlike celiac disease, where we have genetics, we have serology, we have the biopsy, and we can follow these parameters both for diagnosis and for monitoring the condition. In NCGS, this is not the case. Biopsy is normal, serology is normal, what have you. There is no biomarker that identifies this. So it remains a ballpark.
Yeah, as you said, we could easily spend the whole hour talking about non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and I think it'll be interesting to know, to see 10 years from now what the research shows us.
We don't even know if there are complications, for instance, or not. So I think it would be wrong to say, well, it's not as bad as celiac disease. Maybe you can have a little bit of gluten, or maybe you can only be gluten-free for a month and then go back to normal diet. On the other hand, it would just be negative to say you have to be strictly gluten-free for life, because we don't even know that. We don't know if there are complications. Yeah. We know about celiac disease very well, about complications and associated conditions, right, but we just are completely in the blank.
Well, I wonder if you could address a little bit then for people who, I think we have one group of people who are diagnosed with celiac disease, or know they need to be gluten-free, and another group of people who, just for the sake of consistency with us right now, believe they have non-celiac gluten sensitivity or non-celiac wheat sensitivity, whatever that condition is. Let's talk about that group of people first, and then go into the group of people with celiac disease. But for those who have had celiac disease ruled out, just briefly, I would say, what sort of things should they have in mind in terms of continued follow-up, in terms of continued exploration of what might be going on, again, with the aim of, optimizing their health and well-being down the road? Might they develop celiac disease at some point?
Yeah, that's a very important question, also because it's quite possible that a fraction, it's hard to quantify for the reasons we just mentioned, but it's possible that a fraction of these individuals actually have early onset celiac disease that has not been, yet hasn't reached the full-blown state in which you can make a diagnosis. So that's a possibility. So what I would say is the most important thing is to rule out celiac disease. And how can you do that? If you already are on gluten-free diet and you don't want to abandon it because you are feeling well and before you didn't, then I would definitely strongly recommend to have the genetic test performed. Mm-hmm. We now know, we have been knowing this for a couple of decades now, that there are specific genes that are easily determined that must be associated with celiac disease. They belong to the group called HLA class 2. So if you have DQ2 or DQ8 or both, because you can have both, then you may become celiac. You may develop celiac disease at some point in your life. But if you do not have neither DQ2 nor DQ8, then you know for sure you don't have celiac disease for life.
So then, it might be a matter of exploring other potential GI issues.
That would be the first thing to do. The first thing to do would be to be sure, because if you are happy to be DQ2 and DQ8 negative, which is the case for about 70% of the population in North America, then you already know you don't have celiac disease. Does that mean you have to worry less about the diet? Probably, possibly. We don't know that for sure, but possibly. One thing is for sure, all the complications described in celiac, including the most ominous and the rare, which is intestinal lymphoma, do not seem, for what we know so far, do not seem to occur in non-celiac wheat sensitivity. Mm-hmm. So the most important thing is to be sure you don't have anything else. And of course, we are focusing on celiac disease, but as you were mentioning, one needs to be sure there are other conditions that are playing a role. Inflammatory bowel disease being one of them, of course. Mm-hmm. Even irritable bowel syndrome. Sometimes you may just have a diet without FODMAP, without the fructose oligosaccharide.
Right. With regard to genetic testing, just a small aside, I know there are lots of home tests available these days for various things. There's celiac disease testing, home tests for antibodies, right? There are home tests available for genetic testing, because I know we have heard from some people that it's difficult to get the genetic tests, or they don't know how to go about getting those. Are the home tests a valid way to go, in your opinion?
In terms of the genetic test, I think the most important obstacle would be the cost, because they're not cheap, and they come with a relatively high cost. And most health insurance companies would decline the coverage of the test because they claim it's not necessary. And I won't comment further on that. In terms of the serological tests, there are several that are available at home tests. I am also in the, providing consultation and advice for a company called I'm Aware that markets tests that can be done on a droplet of blood at home, and check all the different serological markers that are typical of celiac disease, and they can be definitely utilized. They are quite reliable for both diagnosis and follow-up. And you can test for COVID at home. Actually, today you can test for free for COVID. That's the news of the day. And you can test for pregnancy. You can test for a number of things at home. I see no reason why the 3-4 million people in this country who are expected to be celiac could not be tested for this condition.
Yeah, I think
one thing that I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you.
No problem.
One thing that I'd like to add at this point, though, is that the screening test, the serology test, even though reliable and incredibly useful, is not and should not be ever considered a definitive test for celiac disease.
Right.
You need, once a test is positive or in the dubious range, you need to discuss this with an experienced gastroenterologist that would be able to carry on whatever steps are necessary, and they may be different for children than for adults, to reach a final diagnosis.
But I do think it's important for people to be aware of these home test options, because even though awareness has increased, we still hear from a lot of people who say that, they ask their physicians to test them and they're having a hard time getting that done. So I think it's important to know that there are these options.
This has been at the University of Chicago when I began practicing here. This has been a major, major obstacle. Now things have gotten better, but for this reason, we began 21 years ago now, for the first time, to offer a free screening test for celiac disease with the help of a company that offered the measurement for free. We were able to screen up to 400 individuals every year, just because it was the need. Most physicians would just not test. And this brings me back to part of your original question. Celiac disease has changed, not just the knowledge, the awareness, and the ways we diagnose it, but also has changed in the way it presents itself, with less classical gastroenterological cases. And for this reason, there was a lag, especially in this country, in our ability to diagnose celiac disease, because physicians kept thinking of this as a condition only occurring in young children with a large belly, failure to thrive, malabsorption syndrome. And if you focus your attention on this presentation, you will miss 80, possibly 90% of all celiac individuals. Because there are, as you know, there are so many extraintestinal manifestations that can occur, from headache to seizures, to skin disorders, to liver problems, arthritis, diabetes, and so on. So one needs to have an open mind and to have a good knowledge about the multiform presentation of this.
So clearly, getting the correct diagnosis and getting a diagnosis when it exists is really the first step, of course, to managing the condition properly.
We can never stress this enough.
So I wonder if we could just move on a little bit into then, say for someone with celiac disease, particularly, who has been diagnosed and thinks and is, adhering to a gluten-free diet to the best of their knowledge and ability, feels fine, no symptoms. Is follow-up necessary? What sort of things do you think that they should have on their radar that they should continue to consider to make sure they're maintaining optimal health?
Yeah, this is a good question, great question. The attention of several societies, including the European Society for Pediatric GI, has been focusing on follow-up. And we have just produced a document that will be published in the next couple of months. As you can see, I'm still active also on the other side of the Atlantic. So the follow-up is crucial. I don't think there is anyone in terms of physicians that work in this area for either children or adults that wouldn't support the need for follow-up. Now, how frequently it has to be done, if, in your example, an adult is feeling well, is following the diet, feels knowledgeable about what to do or not to do, and has no symptoms, then this is the best case scenario, which indeed occurs perhaps in about 40 up to 50% of cases. then the follow-up does not need to be so stringent. However, I would still recommend every 2 to 3 years to have follow-ups. If the situation is not as optimal, then perhaps a yearly follow-up, which is what is currently recommended for all children by all the academic societies, would be recommendable. The reason being that minor symptoms or minor transgressions may not lead to major symptoms, but they still may lead to reactivation of the intestinal inflammation. And you don't want that, because if your intestine is still damaged, and there have been studies showing that up to 3/4 of adult celiac patients after a year on gluten-free diet do not have a complete mucosal restoration. So if that is the case, you may want to take some action and take a second look at your diet and at your lifestyle habits, because you really want to preserve your mucosal integrity. Hence, having been checked every 2 to 3 years, even if there are no symptoms, I think would be very recommendable.
Yeah.
And if we focus especially on a group of very vulnerable patients, that is the teenagers, those really need yearly follow-up. We have been insisting on this at University of Chicago and other centers as well, on the need of yearly follow-up for children, because children are developing organisms. They enter different phases in their lives. And if you let a child at 12 and say, all right, you can go and come back in 3 or 4 years, then you probably have lost the compliance that you need to have. Instead, a positive reinforcement done year after year as they grow into young adults, showing that they are doing well because their numbers look well and because their diet has been followed, what a great job you're doing. This is really the best way we can, so to speak, vaccinate them, if you wish, to remain compliant. So we insist on that.
Yeah. So even for adults who are feeling fine, it's still important to have follow-up so that they can have blood work done, because as I think you mentioned, still there's a significant number of people who are not having symptoms, but their blood work does show some exposure to gluten, right? And this brings up the other question of how difficult it really is to absolutely adhere to a gluten-free diet.
It is very difficult. And in fact, unfortunately, studies utilizing this relatively new technique, which is called gluten detect. They detect small fragments of gliadin, gliadin being the most dangerous, if you wish, protein in gluten, that appear in your bloodstream and then are eliminated in the urine. So you can check in your urine these peptides and detect whether or not you have been exposed to gluten in the previous 48 hours or so. This is a useful test to have on board. And by utilizing this, studies have shown that, unfortunately, the vast majority of celiac patients or other patients who were on a strict gluten, what they consider to be a strict gluten-free diet, indeed were ingesting considerable amounts, between 15 in few cases and up to 400 milligrams of gluten per day. And as you know, the minimum amount of gluten that is sufficient to trigger an inflammatory response in the intestinal mucosa of a celiac patient is around 50 milligrams. So substantial amounts of gluten can be entering your diet surreptitiously. So
using some of the home tests such as that can give someone a good snapshot view of whether perhaps they have been exposed. It's not a substitute for having medical follow-up, but it could be sort of an ancillary tool, right?
It is, yes. I think it's something that I would think might be, and as you said correctly, it's a snapshot because it only tells you what happened in the previous 48 hours, the 48 hours that preceded the test. But if you have been eating gluten for 3 months, and then over the last 5 days, you are really gluten-free, the test is going to show that you are gluten-free. So this has to be kept in mind. It's a snapshot of what happened in the previous 48 hours. As I not always, but often happen to tell our celiac patients is, why don't you buy a kit, keep it in your drawer, And then when the occasion arises, then you might want to use it. And what could be the occasion? The occasion could be if you don't feel well, if you all of a sudden develop, abdominal pain or gasiness or bloating or headache, and you think maybe when I went out yesterday, perhaps I ate gluten. Then with this way, you can actually check and then knowing whether or not you have been glutened, as people say.
Right, and then that could, of course, provide information moving forward as to potential sources of this cross-contact that can be avoided in the future.
Yeah. But then, of course, this is still a proxy. I mean, the best test for an overall assessment remains a visit with a dietitian that is knowledgeable about the diet and can help a lot in reviewing a diet, and with a doctor, of course, and having a blood test performed.
Yeah.
Periodically. It doesn't have to be something done, on a monthly basis. You don't have to be panicked.
Right. And I think you alluded to this earlier, but isn't it the case that in a large percentage of cases of people who are still having symptoms or still have positive blood work, it is because there is still too much gluten in the diet. So it's very, very tricky. And this just sort of highlights the important role, I think, of a dietitian being involved to
Absolutely.
really look at all possible sources of gluten getting into the diet.
Absolutely. And this is not just because I'm talking with GIG, which of course is the way that the to-go organization to check your diet. And by the way, thanks again. I have been working with GIG for many years, and you guys also certified for gluten-free the University of Chicago cafeteria, etc.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a long-standing tradition of cooperation.
Yes.
But the importance of dietitian really cannot be underestimated. And unfortunately, studies and surveys have shown that patients tend to dodge that part, maybe because there is a co-payment that is involved, maybe because they think the doctor is more important than the dietitian. So this is not the case of doing hierarchies here. It's a team that works, and in the team, the dietitian is fundamental. So I think many patients think they are gluten-free, and as I said before, they are not. And if you want to really comb your diet and be sure that you are, having a dietitian on board is very important. Yeah.
Right. As you said earlier, this celiac disease is the only autoimmune condition that can be treated by diet alone. And in fact,
exactly. Imagine how people with diabetes or Addison disease would be happy if they could have something like this available. So
I wonder if you could address on this topic of, small amounts of gluten getting into the diet. We keep hearing about, glutenase type substances on the market. And of course, it would be great if such a thing existed, but I don't believe there's anything currently available that's actually effective. But maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. So yes, absolutely. I lost track because I was reading a question on I'm so sorry, but this is
no problem. Just talking about the all the glutenase type substances on the market that claim.
I should not read the questions.
The claim that you can take them and therefore not have to worry about some gluten getting into your diet.
No, absolutely. This is a very important question that gives me the opportunity to stress the fact that really nothing that is currently on the market is completely reliable to digest fully gluten and allow your small intestine not to be exposed to gluten. So that's the bad news. Let's face it, do not believe that anything on now available probiotics or glutenase can be utilized. That said, however, and turning page and going slowly into the future therapies, just to start talking about this topic, the good news is that there are at least a couple of glutenases which have been studied for years, and now one of them is actually in an advanced phase 2 part of the study. Now, phase 2, we define clinical trials by phases. One being the first one, the small group to test safety, then phase 2, safety and efficacy, but still in a small group, and then phase 3, safety, efficacy, dose, variations in the larger groups. So phase 2 is pretty advanced, and we have at least a couple of products that have data published of phase 2 that are extremely encouraging. In some cases, people have been exposed to, in general, it's a moderate amount, that is 2 to 3 grams per gluten per day, which is, however, a reasonable amount of gluten, of bread and pasta, if you wish. Mm-hmm. Considering gluten is about approximately 14% of the weight of the wheat, then 3 grams of gluten it's a good amount of mm-hmm. wheat. And they seem to be extremely encouraging in terms of letting people tolerate this amount without reactivating their immune response by any of the means that this is being measured. Mm-hmm. So I am very optimistic. I can say the names of this product, but they are not yet on the market. So it's just wait and see. But
well, that is very encouraging. Hopefully, before too long, such a thing will be available.
They will come out. But again, these very rigorous and reliable pharmaceutical companies that are sponsoring these investigations have made clear from day one, this is not a replacement to a gluten-free diet. You need to remain on a gluten-free diet to the best of your knowledge. Mm-hmm. But with this, you may worry a little bit less about the issue of cross-contamination, which makes, I think, life much easier for the majority of celiac patients, because this is the real issue.
Yes, exactly. One thing you mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit more about too was the probiotics, and is there a role at all in either prevention, treatment, optimization of health for probiotics, either in supplement or food form, for both children and adults?
Sure, that's another great question. Probiotics have all the prerequisite, the conceivable prerequisite to be effective in ameliorating symptoms in patients with celiac disease. They improve the health of the intestine, especially in terms of their immunity. They improve the permeability, making less likely for exogenous molecules to cross into the submucosal compartment. They restore integrity of inflamed. They have an anti-inflammatory effect. So you would think probiotics could be really useful. Unfortunately, so far, all the investigations done with several, there aren't many, to be honest with you, but there are at least a dozen of studies done in adults with different modalities. And the only one that shows some efficacy is a multi-strain preparation, but only for patients who had normal tissue transglutaminase. So that tells you that they probably had irritable bowel syndrome, and on these symptoms, these probiotics help, which is no surprise, because this is one of the indications for which actually there is documentation of efficacy. Other than that, there is nothing specific. I want also to add, because probiotic is also an area of particular interest of mine, I want to add that not all probiotics are created equal. There are a zillion different preparations on the market, legitimately. However, only for, I don't want to say a handful, but certainly less than 2 handfuls of them have any experimentation of validity being produced. So there is not much evidence for the majority of products that are on the market. But going back to celiac disease, or for non-celiac wheat sensitivity for that matters, I don't think there is any convincing evidence, or not even non-convincing evidence of efficacy, unfortunately. Now, that said, this may not be the case forever, because probiotics might actually have an incredibly important role in prevention of celiac disease. As you know, today we cannot make any primary prevention of celiac disease, so there is no way you can prevent celiac disease from onset. However, there are important advancements in understanding the role of microbiota in modulating the immune system of the intestine, which is the major and pivotal system directing the development of the whole immune system. So during the first few years of life, there are data showing that there may be microbial changes that favor the onset of celiac disease versus other compositions, if you wish, of microbiota that actually appear to be beneficial. So all this leads to the idea, which of course is whetting the appetite of several pharmaceutical companies, of identifying one day one or more probiotics that may serve to restore that kind of beneficial microbiota that may be helpful in preventing celiac disease and maybe even partially in treating. But we are far from that. I don't think this is coming, within the next couple of years. But it's down the line something that you might expect to happen.
Very, very interesting. And I know that you've done some work and some things have come through the University of Chicago regarding prevention or reduction of risk of development of celiac disease in infants when they are at risk genetically. Do feeding habits have any influence, timing on introduction of gluten, amount of gluten, whether the mother breastfeeds or not? Are any of these things, have any of these things been seen to have an effect?
Yeah, so something, in addition to the genetics and to gluten, you need these two, but the perfect storm to develop celiac disease is characterized also by the intervention of other environmental factors of the environment. So the attention has been focusing on what are they and what can we do to block them. So a few things seem to be sure. One, unfortunately, the role of breastfeeding that for years we have been taught. I remember in the 70s and 80s, we thought like a undubitable truth that breastfeeding would be preventive. Instead, there is no role of breastfeeding in prevention of celiac disease. And just let me add quickly as a pediatrician that doesn't mean that breastfeeding is not the best possible way that you can nurture a baby, a human baby. It is, but not for celiac disease. Use of antibiotics does not appear to be detrimental. Vaccinations are not detrimental. However, respiratory infections and viral infections in general appear to have a role in creating that pro-inflammatory environment that then triggers the onset of celiac disease in genetically predisposed individuals who eat gluten. And this is something also that my partner, especially Vanna Jabri and her group at the University of Chicago, has characterized very well. Now, in terms of feeding practices, the most important news that we have learned in the past 2-3 years is actually that babies born in families at risk for celiac disease need not to receive large amounts of gluten during the weaning time. So the first 2 years of life, those that are predisposed genetically to celiac and eat large amounts of gluten are those who will develop celiac disease. Those with low to normal amounts are better off. So do not use excessive amount of gluten in the first years of life.
So just sort of follow normal feeding recommendations.
Yes, normal timing of introduction, 4 to 6 months, normal amount. And the other and last thing also, try to have a Mediterranean diet style for your children. In other words, fish and lots of vegetables, fresh produce, fruits, nuts, grains, cereals, whole grains. All those things are very, very positive in possibly reducing the risk of developing celiac disease. Instead, the so-called Western diet, rich in unsaturated fat, rich in very processed foods, is detrimental. Refined sugar, all of that appears to have actually a role in favoring the development of celiac disease, possibly because they modulate a different type of microbiome.
Right, back to the microbiome. Yeah, it's very interesting. And of course, the Mediterranean diet is known as being a healthful dietary pattern for anyone anyway. So
by all means. And being a Mediterranean guy, I particularly enjoy that.
Exactly. Well, before we get on into questions, I wonder if are any other pieces of information or recommendations that you would have for people who are living gluten-free with regard to, what they should be thinking about or doing at this point, just to really optimize their well-being. We've talked about the diet, having continued medical follow-up.
Yeah, I think having a reliable source of information is also important, because if you open the internet and start surfing, you will find a gigantic amount of information that are in some cases reliable, in most cases totally unreliable. And I could go on with a long list of fake news, so to speak, starting with the coffee that mimic gliding, so for celiac, coffee should be avoided, and you could go on and on with that. I remember years ago there was a cardiologist who actually published a whole book, Wheat Belly, blaming wheat as responsible for belly. This is totally bogus also. So there is a lot of false information. Having reliable sources of information is crucial. The follow-up importance that I was mentioning that too. What else?
Follow-up, including the diet, looking at the diet, of course.
Yeah, looking at the diet, working with the dietitian. And not getting paranoid about the diet, because I have seen also excesses that people would keep their children really in a bubble, prevent. Now, let's forget about the last 2 years, because COVID has actually created that, and we didn't want that.
Right.
But you can't homeschool a child just because this child has celiac. This would be absolutely silly.
Yeah.
And so in some cases, I've seen parents who were going all the way in that direction. This is not what should be done.
Right. So important to consider all aspects of the child's well-being.
There is one more thing that I would recommend that goes again with the diet. Many of the products that are manufactured to be gluten-free, the famous $11 billion of the market, are actually not that healthy, as you know well, because in general, they tend to lack fibers, they tend to lack vitamins, they tend to have more fat, they tend to have more carbohydrates, less oligo elements such as iron, etc. So the relying on foods that you pick up in a supermarket as gluten-free, which are not naturally gluten-free, is not a good idea. So working with the dietitian and helping, leave out those. There are so many wonderful options for a gluten-free diet that are natural. All poultry, all meats, all fish, all eggs, all vegetables, all fruits, millions of grains except wheat, rye, and barley. By the way, oats are safe. All of this has to be enjoyed with a positive sense, and try to stay away from an excessive use of manufactured gluten.
Right, and I think you would agree that what's the key phrase there is to stay away from an excessive use of those, because certainly it's great that people can still enjoy a chocolate chip cookie or whatever it is.
I don't want to blame anyone,
Yeah,
absolutely, that was not my intent.
I understand.
But just reduce that amount in order to avoid the risk of having excessive calories.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I think we should probably get to questions. So I am going to ask Eliza Sherman, who has been compiling questions, if she will go ahead and begin to ask Dr. Guandolini some questions that have come up. Eliza?
Shoot.
Okay, we've got so many questions here. Let me just go over to I'm going to go with a simple question first. You were talking about probiotics. Are there any in particular you recommend taking? And if so, how much should people be taking? I'm just getting a simple one out there. We've got a bunch more.
So it depends on the indication. You see, you would not use a tetracycline for an ear infection, or penicillin if you have pneumonia. So you choose the antibiotic selecting basically the disease you want to treat. The same has to be the concept in probiotics. It depends what you're addressing. So for instance, if you want to prevent the antibiotic associated diarrhea, which is a very common event after using probiotics, perhaps Florastor is the way to go. If I can make commercial names or may not. I'm asking Lola.
That's fine.
So Florastor or Saccharomyces boulardii is a good option. Culturel, lactobacillus is another good option, etc. But if you are treating irritable bowel syndrome, then I would say Visbiome is a better option. So it really depends. But again, there aren't that many around. So I don't know how else. Depends on the condition. In terms of generic use, I don't think you need to use generic probiotics if you are healthy and feel well, or even if you have celiac disease and feel well, you do not have symptoms, you probably do not need a probiotic. If you really, really, really want some, I would say, perhaps I'm repeating myself, perhaps Culturel and Visbiome would be my favorites.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
All right, Eliza.
Yeah, the next question. A lot of people are having trouble finding the right kinds of practitioners. One question is, how can I find a gastroenterologist who is knowledgeable about celiac disease and who takes me seriously about managing my health? And then there was another one about how to find a dietitian who knows a lot about celiac disease. So I think Lola probably has something to say about the second.
I was about to say the second part, of course, I leave it to Lola. For the first part, in terms of finding a doctor knowledgeable in celiac disease, I invented and created, finally came to life in 2013, a national society for the study of celiac disease. Now it's called SSCD, or Society for the Study of Celiac Disease. And involves basically, hopefully, all the players that are interested in the world of celiac disease, physicians, but also dietitians, nurses, and the companies that are interested in working in providing funds for celiac disease, and organizations such as Beyond Celiac, etc. So I think they, in their website, once again, the acronym is SSCD. You may find help in locating a physician that has experience in celiac disease, relatively close, hopefully close to where you are. But it is like there is not an even distribution of that, as you might imagine. In towns and places where there is a university hospital, it's much more likely to find somebody focusing on celiac. The same question asked 20 years ago would have been much easier to answer, because there were like a handful of us working on celiac disease in this country. I could easily make a few names, but now, fortunately, the situation has improved.
And, I would say with regard to a dietitian, I mean, I would venture to say that if you find a gastroenterologist, that a gastroenterologist will be associated with, or at least will be able to refer to, a good dietitian who is knowledgeable in celiac disease. We also have a listing on the GIG website that is provided by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that lists dietitians according to their areas of expertise. So you could check that out. Allison, I don't know if you can possibly pop that link into the chat. That would be my input.
Excellent. Well, actually, a lot of people are talking about the gluten-free, the gluten challenge, that there's a 6-week-long gluten challenge that must be taken. And a lot of people are very concerned about that and wondering, what is the shortest amount of time that they should be consuming gluten prior to getting tested? Because some of these people are saying that they get very, very sick with even the smallest amount of gluten. So it's obviously not something they're looking forward to doing.
Sure. So I think in terms of adults, there are data showing that within 2 weeks of exposure to gluten, 80% of the patients develop clearly changes in their intestinal biopsy, not yet in their serology. Bear in mind, the serology, that is the positive antibody test with TTG, takes more time. So it takes 4, 5, 6 weeks to become positive. But the biopsy gets damaged very quickly. Within 2 weeks, as I said again, 80% of the patients have signs of deterioration that can be diagnostic. There is also one more thing. If you have important symptoms after eating gluten, even after 4 or 5 days, I would say, that's what I used to say to my patients, you can now be receiving the endoscopy with a biopsy, because clearly, if you have those important symptoms for a few days, your intestinal mucosa must have been damaged. You don't expect a flat mucosa, but certainly an increase in intraepithelial lymphocytes. I don't want to get too specific, but some changes that are visible histologically must be evident. But this is just my opinion. There is no solid evidence on this. But the 2 weeks actually is clearly documented. So I would probably go for that. That said, there are studies now, there is research which is trying to do without a gluten challenge. So if you think you have celiac, you are gluten-free, you don't want to have the gluten challenge, you can have a blood test done, and they would take the blood test or a biopsy from the intestine and then put that in the laboratory and look for specific changes in some specific cells that might tell you that you actually have celiac disease. And this is very promising, but not yet available. It's just a research matter yet.
I think people always want to know, when are these going to be available? That's a lot of the questions, or when are these new developments going to be available?
Look, if I had the crystal ball, I would be a millionaire by now, which I'm not. So I can't tell you. But an educated guess, 2 to 3 years.
Okay. So there's a lot of questions about the connection between wheat and gluten and other conditions. Here's one about, is there a connection between wheat or gluten and asthma? I'm a lifelong asthmatic, and since I went off gluten, I have not had to use any inhalers, and I've had no asthma attacks for about 8 years.
That's a very interesting observation. The more we know about celiac disease, the more we keep increasing the list of symptoms and comorbidities. Now, asthma has actually been one of them already. So there was a study, there is this guy, Dr. Ludvigsson in Sweden, who is an epidemiologist focusing on celiac disease. He has published a stream of papers in the last several years on huge numbers, because they have databases of millions and millions of individuals. So it's easy to find meaningful correlation once you have access to all those data. So to make a long story short, yes, there is a correlation with asthma. I was not aware, though, of such a link, meaning that when you are gluten-free, also your asthma regresses. I'm glad that it works for you, but I'm not surprised. I mean, I would accept that, even though clearly celiac is an autoimmune condition and asthma is an allergic condition. So they should travel on separate tracks, so to speak.
Another one was about lactose intolerance and gluten. They sometimes coincide.
Yes, lactose intolerance is pretty common at the time of diagnosis of celiac disease. The reason being that lactase, which is the enzyme that digests lactose is a sugar composed by 2 different carbohydrates, glucose and galactose. Lactase is needed to digest it, break it in 2, and then it can be absorbed. So lactase sits on the top of the villi. Everybody in this audience, I think, knows what villi are in the intestine. So these finger-like projections that in celiac disease are profoundly damaged. So if you lose that, you lose lactase. Hence, you lose the ability of digesting lactose. And you can have symptoms, mostly bloating, diarrhea, abdominal pain. The good news is that the gluten-free diet restores the normal level of lactase in the vast majority of celiac patients within a short time. And we're talking weeks only. So at that point in time, you should be okay. Unless, of course, you belong to the fraction of the population, which is a substantial fraction, that has a genetically pre-programmed loss of lactase. This is something which is a natural condition. Many people, after the age of 8, 10, 12 years, lose their lactase because they are pre-programmed genetically to lose it. And so they become lactose intolerant. So if you have that, of course, there is no recuperating. But if it is due to celiac, you would recuperate your ability to digest lactose relatively soon.
Yeah, thank you. You know what? We are already at the top of the hour, so I think we might need to stop in a minute here. We may be able to answer some of the additional questions and post some information on our website. I would encourage everyone to check back on our website.
Yeah, I would be happy. I would be happy to answering questions through the website. If you can send them.
Great. We can collaborate and get your input.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. I would like to, first of all, thank you, Dr. Guandolini, so much for being with us and sharing your expertise. It's been a pleasure. And I would like to ask all of our attendees to please, if you would, answer just 2 quick poll questions, which will help us plan our future activities so that they're the most useful to you. That would be great. We'd really appreciate it. It's up there now.
And I want to thank all the participants. I was expecting only maybe 40, 50 people, then we gone way beyond that. So
I think we had a good turnout.
I hope this has been helpful. I mean, that's my hope. That's the reason, the only reason I accepted this invitation. So
yes, I'm sure it's been helpful, and that's the reason that we are here too. So thank you, and thank you all for attending. You will be receiving an email with a link to the recording in the future. And thanks again, Dr. Guandolini, and have a good evening, everyone.
thank you. You too. Bye now.
Bye-bye.